So let's talk about belly fat. How do we get rid of it? The $1 million question, right? So, in order to think about and understand how we get rid of belly fat, is to look at how it gets there and accumulates in the first place. When we look even 100 years ago, there were very few people with excessive belly fat. That fat around the abdominal area, that fat around the organs, the fat that can be more harmful, especially if it starts to build up in the liver and cause fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And you probably heard me say time and again that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is driven by insulin resistance. And everything that I talk about today and that you're going to learn today is reinforced by this fact. So, where does the belly fat come from? In essence, it is high insulin and high cortisol levels that is directing the fat storage around the belly and the abdominal region. You've probably heard many health professionals, fitness professionals, nutritionists say, you just have to exercise more to burn that belly fat off. Or maybe I just need to do tons of crunches in order to get rid of the belly fat. And I hope you've also heard that you cannot spot tone and just burn fat off from someplace in your body by doing extra exercise or more resistance training to that area. It's got to come off, and fatty acids need to be burned off inside the body with lower insulin levels, letting the body actually get to fat burning and lose body fat from everywhere in the body rather than spot toning, rather than doing 1,000 crunches at the gym and hoping to learn to lose that body fat. Now, I'm not saying that exercise isn't great and strength training isn't great, and strengthening the core area isn't fabulous and helpful, but you can strengthen it all you want and have the strongest core that there is, but still have extra body fat there. And for women, especially, that body fat sits on top of the muscle. And so it can be very frustrating and very unattractive for many people. So again, it's the high cortisol and the high insulin that's really driving the deposition of fat in the abdominal region. But really it comes down to insulin, because I also say cortisol because high cortisol levels are going to, in a roundabout way, cause high insulin, because when we have high cortisol levels from lack of sleep, excessive stress, stressful events all day long, that is going to increase our blood sugar response. We're going to release blood sugar from our muscle and liver cells, and in the form of storage, like sugar and carbohydrates that's stored. Your body's going to release those for quick fuel in an effort for you to deal with that stressor. And so those increase in glucose causes an increase in an insulin response. So it all comes back to the insulin, but high cortisol really is a key player in driving high insulin levels. Now, we have been, as not only in the United States, but worldwide, very fat phobic for the last 50 years or so. It started around in the 70s, where some really cherry-picked data came from a researcher named Ansel Keys, where he basically led us to believe that fat and saturated fat is driving obesity, driving heart disease, and driving the fat deposition around our organs. This is very false, and this has been proven time and again in more recent literature and recent studies. And looking at a compilation of many, many studies, this has been debunked, but it's been so reinforced over the last 50 years that many, many people still think that eating fat makes you fat. So we have to remember that when we go to the grocery store and we see all of these products that are labeled as fat-free, low fat, whatever it is, natural. Like, don't be fooled by that. Fat does not make you fat. The macronutrients that you eat, just because you eat them as fat, doesn't mean that you utilize them as fat in your system. And I'll talk about that more in just a few minutes. But we know that fat is actually the preferred fuel for the human body. And the human body is really good at storing body fat, as you may very well know. You may have excessive fat stores that you've been trying to get rid of for a very long time. And you have to remember how the human body functions and how our ancestors were set up to eat nutritionally. So our ancestors were set up, we've always need continuous fuel, right? We always need continuous energy. It's not like we can just flip a switch in our body and say, I'm going to turn you off right now, like you would a computer or your phone or whatever. Like, you can't just turn your body off, right? There's this constant need for fuel. But our ancestors hundreds of years ago, not even that long ago, 100 years and more, didn't have access to the fuel that we have access to now. They went long periods of time without eating. They went into ketosis. They weren't eating multiple times a day. And they used their fat stores in time of need so that we could survive as a species. We have a little bit of storage potential as carbohydrates in our body. We can store carbohydrates in our muscles and in our liver, about a day's worth for both men and women. And then body fat, we can store with almost unlimited storage potential. So when we look at how we're set up as a species, again, we have a little bit of carbohydrate storage and then unlimited body fat storage. If we didn't have that fat storage potential, we would have died out as a species long ago. You can only survive with your carb stored fuel for about a day. That's it. After that, you burn through those glycogen stores, that more quick energy, and then your body is forced to go and look for stored body fat. Now, it's going to use carbohydrate and glycogen if it's there and it's available, because it's quick, easy fuel to burn. But once that's gone, then it looks for body fat to burn. So even thin, healthy people who are at the optimal weight will have weeks to months of body fat stores to live off of. And some people have months. I've known of one individual who fasted without any food for over a year. It was like 369 days, and burned his own body fat for fuel for an entire year. But remember that that's how we are set up as humans. So in the past, we did not have access to constant food. We didn't have grocery stores. We didn't have crappy food where 80% of the food in grocery stores isn't actually food. It's more of frankenfood. It's processed. It's made in a factory. So most of the food that people are eating, standard American diet, is processed. It's high carb, it's high sugar, it's inflammatory oils, it's very high in grains, and way high in carbohydrate. And we are constantly burning our carbohydrate fuel sources because they're constantly coming in, and we're never left to actually burn body fat. There's a lot of people who very rarely are tapping into their fat fueling system because they're constantly burning carbohydrate. So it's just been in very recent history that we've had excessive food available. And basically, there are a lot of humans on the planet right now who have never been in a fasted state for more than several hours. So maybe they're only in a fasted state for 8 or 10 hours while they're sleeping. The rest of the time, they're in a feasted, fed state. That's not how humans are designed to live optimally, because we have two fueling systems. We have the carb fueling system and the fat burning fueling system. And if you're constantly feeding your body excessive amounts, excessive carbohydrates, and many, many times throughout the day, you're never really tapping into that fat burning, fueling system. So just keep that in mind when you think about, gosh, it's so easy to store fat. Like humans are predispositioned to store fat so that you can use it in times of famine. We had feasting and we had famine. And now the humans on the planet are basically in feast mode all the time and hardly ever go into famine mode. So I want to talk about the type of fat that we store as humans. It's primarily saturated fat, and that's where some of this information comes from, and people being afraid of saturated fat because they look at the storage form of fat in the body, and it's primarily saturated fat. There's a 16 or a C16 fatty acid molecule called palmitic acid that's stored in the belly, and there's a C18 fatty acid chain called stearic acid that's also stored in the central belly area, and those are saturated fats. The reason why we store saturated fat is because it's a very efficient fuel. And so when our body is called upon to burn body fat, saturated fat is very stable and it's a very clean burning energy source. Now, a lot of people, or a lot of you, are probably thinking, well, why would I eat a lot of saturated fat if that's the type of fuel that I burn or that I store? Like, why would I eat a lot of saturated fat if that's what's stored in the belly region? Like, that makes sense to, like, okay, if I don't eat saturated fat, I won't store it. But that's just not how the body works. And that's not how most even animals work. If we take a cow, for example, a cow never eats saturated fat, almost never, right? They're eating grass and hay. Grass is their natural diet. Grass doesn't have any fat or saturated fat, right? It's carbohydrate. It's a ton of carbohydrate. That's what cows eat. Now, we aren't able to break down grass like cows do. They have 6 stomachs in order to do so. But my point is they are eating almost all carbohydrate and their body converts it to saturated fat to store. When we eat beef, the fat that is in their abdominal region and around their bodies primarily saturated fat as well, because it's a stable fat. So eating saturated fat does not cause you to store saturated fat. Your body will convert anything to fat. And we know this, right? If you're eating a surplus of fat, your body will store it as fat. If you're eating a surplus of carbohydrates and sugar, you will still store, your body will convert those carbohydrates to fat and store it if it's in excessive amounts, and especially if your insulin levels are high. So even think about a vegan, somebody who's been a vegan for years and years and years, but they still have central obesity. They still have type 2 diabetes. They still have fatty liver. They haven't eaten any saturated fat or animal products in years, and yet they have this fatty liver. So that explains, like, it's just not true that if you eat animal products and you eat saturated fat, that you're going to reduce your fatty liver or you're going to reduce that central obesity. It's all about bringing insulin levels down, bringing sugar down, bringing processed carbohydrates down so that you can be in a fat burning state. I cannot stress that point enough. So we probably all know somebody who eats a very low fat diet. They eat primarily plant food, but yet they still have all of these disease processes wreaking havoc in the human body. And that is why, because your body likes to store saturated fat because it's a very efficient fuel to burn. It doesn't mean that we should avoid it. And if we decrease the amount of saturated fat that we eat, that we're not going to store it. Because again, your body will easily convert excessive carbohydrates to fat. And it's just not, carbohydrates are not the clean burning source that saturated fat is. So it's more about the type of hormones that are triggered by the foods that you eat that results in storage of body fat and storage of especially central obesity. And eating a high carb, high sugar diet is going to drive insulin levels up. When we have high levels of insulin, we store body fat very easily because there's just really no place for that energy to go because your cells have become resistant to storing and utilizing energy. Now, I want to further explain this because I think that it's interesting that you understand how your body and your organs and how different systems in your body can burn and utilize fat as well. So many people argue, what is the preferred fuel for humans? Is it carbohydrate or is it fat? We know that we typically don't use protein for fueling very often. Your body doesn't really like to do that. It'll first call on carbohydrates if it's there, just because it's easy to burn, or fat. It's an extra step. Like if you have excessive protein, your body will convert it into carbohydrates, but it's just an extra step for the body. So it doesn't really like to utilize protein as its primary fuel source. But when we look at what we burn for calories overall in the course of the day and what our organs are using for energy, it's super interesting. I find this very, very fascinating. So we have what is called our BMR, our basal metabolic rate. That's about how much we burn, how much energy we burn over the course of the day as humans. If we did nothing, if we just lay down on the couch all day long and had very little movement, we didn't eat, we didn't do anything, we would have what is called our BMR, or our basal metabolic rate, where it's just what our body needs to stay alive, basically, and do all the processes that it needs to do. For most humans, like we're talking the average adult of about 150 pounds, the BMR compiles about 70% of the energy that you burn throughout the day, which equates to about 1,400 calories for most humans. Again, this is going to vary. A small woman will be lower. A very large man with a lot of muscle mass or a very obese person will have a higher BMR, because even though fat doesn't burn as much fuel, it does burn some fuel. So the second thing we want to consider is our movement. So even if you're not doing excessive exercise, you're not doing a hard workout, just daily movement, walking around, going about your regular day equates to about 20% of what you burn off throughout the course of the day, or about 400 calories. And then we have what is called thermogenesis in our body, where thermogenesis is basically where your body creates heat through certain functions that it does, like eating. When you break down food, that takes some energy. You have to create enzymes, you have to create all of these gastric juices. That equates to about 10% of your overall metabolic rate throughout the course of the day, or about 200 calories or so. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because we want to look at the different organs and the different organ systems and look at what they prefer to use as fuel. And in the vast majority of cases, your organs are using fat to burn for energy about 85% of the time. I find this, again, like I said, I find this very fascinating. So the liver is the most metabolically active organ that you have. I always thought, like brain or heart, but it's actually the liver. The liver is so busy. Your liver does amazing things. You have no idea it's doing. It's basically controlling all the energy input and telling your body what to use for fuel, and it's, breaking things down. It's, sending out all these hormones and signals, and it's, detoxifying. It's an amazing, amazing organ. But of the BMR, the liver is utilizing or is responsible for about 27% of that basal metabolic rate. And so the energy that your body's outputting, the liver is about 27% of that, which equates to about 378 calories a day. Now, I don't want you to get like all wrapped up in these calories. I'm just giving you examples and what the body likes to utilize as fuel. And the liver over the course of the day will utilize fatty acids for its fuel about 85% of the time. So it likes to use fatty acids for fuel. The next is the brain that utilizes about 19% of the BMRs coming from brain function. And again, the brain takes about 75% of its fuel from fat. Now, if you're in a ketogenic state, this is going to vary a little bit, and this can get a little bit confusing. So your brain either utilizes glucose for energy or ketones. It won't utilize fatty acids like a lot of the other organs and muscle tissues will. It needs to utilize ketones, which ketones are byproduct of fat metabolism. So the fatty acids need to be sent to the liver first. Like I said, the liver does amazing things. The liver is going to break down that fatty acids, and the byproduct of ketones can cross the blood-brain barrier. And so your brain can utilize that for fuel. Your brain loves to use ketones for fuel. If you have brain fog or you're not thinking straight, you feel like you're just always lethargic and you always hear about those people who go on the ketogenic diet and all of a sudden they can think so much clearer. It's because the brain likes to utilize ketones as fuel, and it'll utilize that 75% of the time. And more so if you're in a ketogenic state. And that equates to about 266 calories of the BMR. And then your muscles are next. They, at rest, will utilize about 18% of that BMR over the course of the day. And they use about 85% fatty acids. And then the kidney is very busy as well. It's a small organ, but it 10% of the BMR is coming from the kidney. The kidney's doing its work, and that uses fatty acids 85% of the time. 85% of its energy come from fatty acids. The heart is very high. It really likes to utilize fatty acids. And you might think that's weird because, it's like we're dying of heart disease and the heart doesn't like fat. It's like, no, the processes that drive heart disease are insulin resistance and fat accumulation around the organs because we have too much insulin and too much energy. But the energy that the heart likes to burn is fat, and it utilizes 90% of its energy as fatty acids. Or about 98 calories. And then all the other processes in the body are about 19%. And again, they utilize fatty acids about 85% of the time for 266 calories. So my whole point is your organs like to use fatty acids. And you might say, well, I have these lots of friends, again, who are on vegan diets or low-fat diets. Like, how are they utilizing fat if they're not eating fat? And it's because your body will convert it. So that's why when we eat higher fat and we eat saturated fat, which we've been told not to eat, that your body is always actually like craving that, like, oh, it's really stable. It doesn't have to convert anything. It likes it. It keeps stabilized blood sugars that way. You don't provoke an insulin response. So these may be very new concepts and things that you've never heard about before, but most of the organs and your body prefer to use fatty acids, not carbohydrate. Now, there are a few cells in the body that must use carbohydrate because they don't have a mitochondria. And the reason why that is important to know is because fat metabolism happens in the mitochondria of the cell in a process called oxidative phosphorylation. And there are a few cells in the body that don't have red blood I just gave one away, that don't have mitochondria. So they need to use carbohydrate because they aren't able to do the oxidative phosphorylation to use body fat or to use fatty acids as fuel because they don't have mitochondria. And those are red blood cells, the retina in your eye, and other eye tissues. So those are the only things. So the lens of the eye, the retina of the eye, and red blood cells. Those are the only exceptions of cells that actually need to have carbohydrate in order to function correctly. So we are burning, about when we look at our overall calorie burn throughout the course of the day with our BMR, our movement, our thermogenesis, we're using about 1,500 calories of fatty acid metabolism. So that just tells us that our body prefers to use fatty acids for fuel. So this whole idea that we need to eat all of these carbohydrates in order to feel well and keep our energy levels up is just a farce. We're eating so many carbohydrates and we're eating so frequently that our insulin levels are up. And when our insulin levels are up, that is what is provoking the fat storage, especially around the abdominal area. Now, another thing to keep in mind that's super interesting, and I've learned this, it's been a hard lesson for me, is that a lot of like your daily movement, your strength training, your walking, where you don't get to a carb threshold of, or not a carb threshold, where you don't get to an aerobic threshold of over 120 beats per minute, if you can keep your heart rate under that, that's going to primarily use body fat or fatty acid, not body fat, I should say fatty acids for fuel. Whereas if you go above that threshold, your body is demanding more and more oxygen and more energy. So you have to burn it faster. And that's where you really burn carbohydrate, which is okay. But if you are wanting to burn body fat and stored body fat and break down stored body fat, really, we don't want to do excessive amounts of anaerobic activity to the point where we're stressing our bodies, because number one, we're going to push our body more into carbohydrate metabolism over fatty acid metabolism. And number two, we may raise our levels of cortisol. And remember, high levels of cortisol throughout the day is going to drive up insulin as a secondary response. So I used to run a ton. I used to think I have to burn all these calories. I have to be sweating all the time. I have to go to the gym. I have to work out 6 to 7 days a week. I have to run 20 miles a week. And that was a lot of stress on my body. Now I do primarily strength training 2 to 3 times a week, and I walk most other days. I do some running, like 3 to 5 miles at a time, but I don't do excessive amounts like I used to. And that keeps my cortisol levels down so that I don't drive the insulin levels up. So wrapping things up, the best way to lose body fat is to reduce insulin resistance. And if you're new to this podcast, you're new to my teaching, there are over 100 episodes that you can listen to about reducing and reversing insulin resistance. I have lots of courses about them. My book, Fast to Heal, that teaches you how to start to reverse insulin resistance. My highest level course is Low Insulin Academy. That is in an on-demand version or a live version. You can join Low Insulin Academy and start reversing your insulin resistance. That is what's going to, in a roundabout way, reduce your belly fat over the course of time. Because you bring the insulin down, your body is allowed to start burning stored body fat rather than storing it. You're burning it instead of storing it. And then the belly fat starts to reduce, but it takes some time. So Low Insulin Academy is an on-demand version, or the next live version is starting in September. And you can find the links. You can go to fasttoheal.info/Low Academy online, or fasttoheal.info/Low Insulin Academy live to get on the wait list for the next live course. So it's not about not eating saturated fat. Like, that's not why we store body fat. That actually is a stable fat that can reduce inflammation. It's inflammation neutral. And I do want to talk about, in closing, the types of fat that you're eating, because like I said, saturated fat is anti-inflammatory. It's a neutral fat. plant-based fats that are in their natural states. Those are all okay for body, for fat consumption. It's the inflammatory seed oils that drive inflammation and again increase insulin resistance. So those are the fats that you want to stay away from. And we have been told to eat these fats. And this is why this really plays a huge role in insulin resistance too. So remove those inflammatory seed oils such as cottonseed, canola, corn, safflower, sunflower, soybean, rice bran. Those are all terrible oils that cause inflammation in the body. Get those out of your diet. They're mostly in processed foods. And when you go out to eat, so if you eliminate your processed foods, you're going to eliminate the vast majority of those seed oils. So get those out of your diet. And then look at the frequency of your meals intake. I'm big on intermittent fasting. I'm big on longer fasts for those with really advanced insulin resistance and disease states. Just don't go overboard on anything. Don't listen to this and say like, oh, Shanna said saturated fat is great. I'm just going to eat 3 packs of bacon for lunch. Like there's no superfood that you should eat all of the time. We need to have a well-rounded diet. We need to eat some, natural fiber. We need to hit our protein targets, and we need some very stable fats in our diet. And again, it's not about crunches. It's not about calorie reduction. It's about stabilizing and lowering insulin and keeping our cortisol managed.